Okay, so this is our setup here. We have the manifold gauge, the low side line, the evacuate and refill line, and the high pressure line. Right now the system is empty, so we see 0 on the gauges. These are the connections. This is for front air conditioning vehicle. High side connection, these are quick couplers. Low side connection. Make sure all the switches and everything, all the fittings are tight. This is the line down to the vacuum pump. This is a 3 cubic foot per minute pump. You want to make sure that the oil level is full before you start. This is the exhaust port. You will see some vapor coming out of here during the evacuation process. So, all my lines are connected. The valves, the high and low pressure valves, are open. And I'm now going to start evacuating the system. So right now you'll see there's about 0 vacuum in the system. I ran it a second ago, so there's a little bit. Now it's at 0. Turn on the pump. And now we'll see the vacuum. Sucking down. The manual calls for at least 20 minutes of vacuum until you get it to about 27 to 30 inches of mercury. So we're going to let it go for about 20 minutes. It's already pulling about 26, 27 right now. So we're going to let it go for about at least 20 minutes. Then we're going to shut it off, wait about 5 minutes and see if there's any leak in the system. We'll know if there's a leak if that vacuum starts dropping. Okay, so I've been drawing a vacuum on my system now for about 30 minutes. While the system was evacuating the air conditioning system, I was inside evacuating my colon. And it is also very important that during this process that you make sure you have crazy scientist hair, and occasionally you go ha 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 ha, so the neighbors think you're doing something really cool and dangerous. So what we're going to do now, is the vacuum pump is still going, is we're going to close both the high and low pressure valves and then shut off the pump, and we will try to make sure that the vacuum level does not decrease during that time. If it does decrease during that time, let's say 5 minutes, that means that we have a leak in our system. So, before I shut off the pump, we're going to go ahead and close down the low and the high pressure lines. And I'm going to shut off my vacuum pump. And now we'll wait about 5 minutes to see and make sure that the vacuum does not decrease. So, during that time, I'm going to check on some of my specifications for the air conditioning system. For this van, I have front air conditioning only, which requires, according to the manual, about 2 pounds of refrigerant. Now, these cans are 12-ounce cans. 1 pound is 16 ounces. I want 2 pounds, so that's 32 ounces. Now, if you read the can closely, it says that we have synthetic refrigerant R134A, plus we also have a leak sealer and moisture and acid eliminator. So what that basically boils down to is, in this 12-ounce can, you're not actually getting 12 ounces of refrigerant because you also have some oil in the can. So look back here on the contents of the can. It says we have 11 ounces of refrigerant of tetrafluoroethane and 1 ounce of lubricant. So in order for me to get up to the required amount of refrigerant, which is 32 ounces, I need to use 3 cans. Thinking that each can has 11 ounces, 3 cans is going to give me 33 ounces of refrigerant. But you have to also take into account that there's going to be refrigerant in the lines. Now, I've read that there can be possibly up to 3 ounces of refrigerant in your lines. So my system requires 32 ounces, and I'm going to be putting in 33 according to the cans, but in actuality it's going to be less than 33 because I could have up to 3 ounces in my lines, so I might only be putting in about 30 ounces of refrigerant. So I have another can of refrigerant that doesn't have oil because I don't want to end up adding too much oil to my system too. So I have bought one of these that has no oil. Okay, just to be on the safe side of things, I've waited about 15 minutes now to see if the vacuum levels have dropped. Still up exactly 30 inches of mercury after 15 minutes, so I think that's a pretty good assessment that my system is nice and tight, no leaks. So what I'm going to do now, I have both the high and low valves all the way closed. I'm going to disconnect my vacuum line. The pump is off. It's been off now for 15 minutes. I disconnect this line. Now by disconnecting this line, I am potentially allowing some atmosphere, even though there appears to be some sort of valve in there. I may be allowing some atmosphere and moisture to be entering this line. So after I connect my cans, I will show you that we will actually let a little bit of the pressure on this line escape into the atmosphere, which is not exactly recommended by the EPA, but I don't want any contaminants in my system. So I'll show you that in a bit. As we can see from the pump, there was a little bit of expenditure of oil during the evacuation process, which is perfectly normal. So we've disconnected our line. We will now be putting in the refrigerant in. Now, like I said before, this can has 1 ounce of refrigerant. Now, my system is a brand new system. There was no oil in any of the pieces except for the pump, which has 6 ounces of PAG oil in the pump. Now, according to my manual, it's a little confusing, but this system with front air conditioning only should take between 8 and maybe as much as 9.5 ounces of oil. So I have 6 ounces of oil in my pump already, and each of these cans has 1 ounce of oil, so that gets me up to about 9 ounces of oil, which I feel pretty comfortable with. It seems to be about, between the 8 and 9.5 that the manual has indicated. So this is my can of refrigerant. You need a valve that has an adapter to go to the lines, which looks like this. You need to make sure that the valve is in the, what will actually be the closed position, which will be completely unscrewed. When you screw the valve clockwise, screw it down, there is a pin inside of here. Let's see. Screw this down. There's a sharp metal pin that comes down and will actually puncture the top of the can. So when you screw this valve down, it's actually in the open position. Open meaning that now you can have refrigerant flowing out of the can. But we have nothing connected yet, so we want the valve to be in the closed position, which is all the way unscrewed, so that when we tighten this down on the bottle, it does not puncture yet, because if it punctures and we have no line attached here, refrigerant is going to shoot out at very high pressure at you, and that's very dangerous. So you want to make sure your valve is all the way unscrewed in the counterclockwise position. So we'll do that. Just to be sure, visual check, make sure that the pin is not sticking down before we attach it to the can. So we're going to screw this into the can. And I'll set the phone down for a second while I tighten it. Okay. The valve is now tight on the can. Now, there are instructions on the can, and they differ a little bit than the instructions that came with my air conditioning vacuum pump. I trust the instructions that came with the pump a little bit more than I do with the ones on the can. especially because they seem a little bit less stressful because the engine doesn't need to be running. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to connect this yellow line to the can, and I'm going to press this valve to let any atmosphere that has collected in this tube, since it's been disconnected from the pump, and then we're going to fill the line up to about 50 psi. Now, the difference between the instructions that came with the pump and the ones on the can is that the ones on the can say to have the engine running during this time. So, for me, that's a little bit more stressful, just one more variable that I have to account for while I'm filling the system. So instead, I'm going to go by the instructions that came with the pump, which say to fill it to 50 psi before you turn on the vehicle. So, we're going to connect the refill line to our can, like so. Alright. Now, you want to make sure these are closed for the time being. And let's see what our instructions here say. Make certain that both the high and low pressure valves are in the closed position. Connect them to the system. Open the valve on the refrigerant source, and then we're going to open the low side valve on the manifold gauge set. But, like I said, we may have some atmosphere that's gotten into here. So, I'm going to open the valve on the can, which means screwing it down so that we puncture the seal on the can, which will then release the refrigerant into the line. But at that point, we will have a mixture of refrigerant and atmosphere. This valve is closed, so it's not going into my system yet. So what I'm going to do is, once I tighten this down and puncture the seal, refrigerant and atmosphere will mix in here. I'm going to hit this pressure valve to release that. I will hold it down for maybe 1 or 2 seconds, just long enough to clear out that line and make sure I just have refrigerant in the line and not a mixture of refrigerant and atmosphere, because remember, the atmosphere has moisture in it, which is water, nitrogen, and if that gets back into my system, it'll create acids within the system. So I want to make sure I'm just putting refrigerant into the line. So I'm going to tighten this down, which will puncture the seal on the can. Make sure that everything's tight. Okay. You can hear it flowing. We've punctured the seal. Okay. Now we're going to back it off, because once it's punctured, it doesn't really matter. Well, if I have the closed all the way down, it shuts it off. So after I punctured it, I'm going to unscrew this, and I'll open the valve. Okay, so now we have a pressurized line. It's a mixture of refrigerant and atmosphere. So I want to get rid of the atmosphere. So for about 2 seconds, I'm going to press in the Schrader valve, and I'm going to release that mixture. Okay, well, apparently if you unscrew this too much, you end up shutting it all back off. So after you've punctured the bottle, unscrew it just a little bit, and it'll still allow refrigerant to flow. Now we've pressurized this line. I want to get rid of the mixture of atmosphere and refrigerant, so I'll hold this for about 2 seconds. Okay, I've now cleared that line, and we are now ready to start charging the system up to 50 psi. So what I need to do now is I have a pressurized line. I'm going to open the low side valve, allowing refrigerant to flow. I want to get it up to about 50 psi. So you want to agitate the can. Okay. So, with the engine off, I have charged the system up to about maybe a little bit more than 50 psi. The valve, once it's at 50, you close it. The can is also closed off. So the next step in our instructions, close the low side valve on the manifold gauge. We did that. Both high and low side valves on the manifold gauge must be off. Now we're going to go to next step number 4, which is starting the vehicle and ensuring that we have adequate airflow through the front of the vehicle, so make sure there's no obstructions in the front. And then we're going to start the vehicle, we're going to turn on the air conditioner, and we're going to set the controls for maximum cooling and highest fan speed. So, enjoy the sound of my modified buzzer down there. It's not quite as irritating as it would normally be. We're going to go ahead and we're going to turn the car on. Air conditioning controls here. Make sure it's set to cool. We're going to turn it on to max AC and high blower. Now my vents are kind of disassembled at the moment, so I'm not quite sure where I'm going to have my air blowing out. Figure it out. Okay, so we've now turned on the engine. We have it set for max AC and maximum fan. Right now my valve is still closed both on the can and on the manifold. As we can see, pressure has dropped down to 30 psi. So basically now what I want to do is I want to open up the valve on the can again, open up the low pressure side valve, and I want to agitate the can until I get up to 50 psi in the system while it's running. Now this may require more than one can of refrigerant. I've already figured out I'm going to need about 3. During that time we are going to need to shut off the valve on the can and on the manifold to make sure that when I detach the can that I don't have any back pressure coming out. It's going to basically be evacuating my system of refrigerant again. It's going to leak into the atmosphere. So I'm going to screw this down so that I release refrigerant pressure from the can into my line. Open up manifold. See right away it starts charging. Now my compressor is going to kick on at some point. Watch that pressure. Agitate the can. See it going out. Here the compressor kicked on a few times but then went right back off because the pressure dropped. It kicked on for a second there and then went right back off because my pressure is still not quite high enough to keep the compressor running. I can feel now that my can is just about empty. You want to agitate it pretty much between 3 o'clock and 12 o'clock position the whole time. Basically the idea of that is you want gas refrigerant entering the system and not liquid. But being that it's going up this line, it's pretty much only going to go in as gas anyway. So, the can is almost empty. See that we still have not reached the recommended level because I still have about 2 cans to go. So just keep agitating this can during the whole time. It's about 81 degrees here in California today. So the can is already pretty warm. If you were in a cold climate, you could put the can inside of like a bucket of hot water to increase the pressure inside the can. so it won't take quite as long for the contents of the can to empty into the system. That's really only if you're in cold climates or if you're in a real big hurry. It takes maybe about 10 to 15 minutes for the can to dispense all of its refrigerant. Being that this is my first can, it went a lot faster than the second and third cans will go. By the time I get up to my third can, it's going to take a lot longer to empty the contents. Okay, so this first can is pretty much empty. I can feel it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close off the low side line. And now I'm going to unscrew this to make sure, just in case the can is not empty. I'm just going to make sure that the valve in the can closes before I detach the hose. The can should be empty. Okay, a little bit of oil there. Attaching the line. Nice little mess. Clean off your fingers. Clean off the line a little bit. Okay, so I want to make sure this is all the way unscrewed so that when I screw it into my new can, I don't puncture the seal right away and have refrigerant exit. So, remove this adapter from the old can. Save these because there's a $10 refundable deposit, at least there is in California. New can of refrigerant. Make sure that that puncture pin is not down yet. Screw this onto the new bottle. Make sure it's tight. Reconnect our line to the can. Now remember that since we disconnected this, we've now allowed atmosphere to enter the line again, so we're going to need to evacuate that line again. So, screw the valve down until it punctures the can. You should hear the refrigerant flow once it's punctured. Okay, back it off a little bit. Now we should have a pressurized line. So I want to evacuate the mixture of atmosphere and refrigerant for about 2 seconds. Still not ready. Alright, well, I need to mess with this for a second to get it to evacuate, so hang on. Okay, well, somehow we had a defective can here. The can is totally full. I punctured the top, but nothing came out. So that's a little weird. Anyway, I've now put on another can, and valve up here is closed. We want to evacuate this line of the mixture of atmosphere and refrigerant. So we'll let that out and destroy the atmosphere a little bit. So now we're ready to continue charging the system. We're still only at about 35 psi. So right now I have a pressurized line. I'm going to open the valve, start pressurizing the system again. Keep an eye on that. I'm going to agitate my can. Hear the compressor starting to kick on. And now this is my second can. It's going to take a little bit longer for it to empty. Alright, so right in the middle of refilling my air conditioning system, I had a bit of a malfunction blower motor. Here we got the old motor, made in the USA, and here we have the new one, made in China. So, there's a little troubleshooting here. Brand new motor. Worked for about 2 minutes. Now, plug it in, get nothing. This is the old motor. Fires right up. I got screwed. Okay, so as you can see, it's dark now because we had a couple problems. First problem was they had a defective can of refrigerant, so I had to send a friend out to get me another can. Second problem was during the middle of the process, the blower motor over there in the corner, even though it's a brand new motor I just installed, apparently it died. So I had to put the old motor back in, and it works fine. So I don't understand, because the motor I put it in is an AC Delco motor, but apparently made in China, which doesn't exactly make sense. But anyway, so now I'm getting ready to do my third can of refrigerant. Disconnected it here, and we're going to start filling the system again. So here's the process. Once again, we're going to make sure this is tight. Make sure that's tight. Both valves are off. Screw this down into the new can and puncture that seal. Back it off a little bit. Alright. We should have a pressurized line, which will evacuate a little bit. Okay, so we released any atmosphere that got into the line. Also got myself a nice spritzing of oil. And so now basically we're going to charge with our third can of refrigerant. We're at about 30 psi. As soon as I open this up, we're going to start charging the system again, and we're going to shut it off when it gets to about 50. Alright, so open that valve. Start agitating our can. We'll slowly watch that number climb over the next 10 to 15 minutes. Alright, so as you can see, now up to about 40 psi. My experience with these cans so far is that the valve, once you puncture it, it's a little iffy. Sometimes you gotta mess with it a little bit before the refrigerant starts flowing. It gets stuck or something. So anyway, I had that problem a second ago. It wasn't flowing, so I had to screw it down and unscrew it a couple times to get the refrigerant to flow again. And as soon as it did, I noticed that the pressure started increasing right away. So while you're refilling the system, you notice the pressure is not increasing, and the can does not start getting cold and chilly, then maybe the refrigerant is not flowing, and then you got to mess with that valve a little bit to get it flowing again. And as soon as it does, you'll see that pressure increase. Alright, well, I ended up putting in just about all of a fourth can too, which is should technically be overcharging the system. I wasn't able. Pressure should have been about 50 psi, so I'm not entirely sure if something's wrong. But anyway, the air inside is blowing pretty freaking cold. It's like freezing in here, so it's definitely working. So this can is just about empty, and I think I'm pretty much done. Okay, I've now disconnected couplers. I can hear some noise. You want to make sure, okay, that's just that thing calming down. But you want to look in your valves after you disconnected. You'll see some oil down in there, and watch to see if you hear any hissing noises or any bubbling or anything, just to make sure that that Schrader valve is completely closed. Because if it isn't, you know, over the course of a couple days, all of your refrigerant will leak back out into the atmosphere. So go ahead and look in there and see if you see any bubbling, and also look into the other Schrader valve here and see if you hear any hissing or bubbling. And just kind of like in general, just listen. So, see if you hear any weird noises. Other thing to note, I showed you that after when you put on a new can, you basically had refrigerant mixing with the atmosphere inside the hose. So then I pressed the Schrader valve to release some of that. The refrigerant that I'm using also had oil in it. So you'll notice that every time I did that, oil also shot out all over the place. So when you do that, make sure it's not aimed at your face, or you're going to have like a little mess on your hands. So there you go.